She's award-winning branded content strategist and consultant, as well as a board member of the Native Advertising Institute. As the former director of creative strategy for Timing, she led the initiative for sponsored content programs, including partnership with Netflix and its Orange is the New Black production. Please give you a warm welcome to Miss Melanie Deziel.
Hi there, thank you all for having me. That's a pretty great intro. I wish every room I walked into was like that. Sadly not. Not when you start from humble beginnings as a journalist. We don't get quite as much fanfare for our adventures. So I started out studying investigative journalism. I learned how to look at data and turn it into stories. I studied that at the University of Connecticut. And then I learned that people weren't really hiring people who knew how to turn data into stories. So I got a master's degree in arts and cultural editing. And then I learned that people don't really hire people to write criticism of the arts anymore either. So I had to figure out, how can I take these skills and put them to use in a different way in this new media landscape? I went over to the Huffington Post, where I helped found a team that's now known as Huffpost Partner Studio. It's an in-house team that creates content on behalf of advertisers to live on the Huffington Post website. We grew that team inside of a year from 3 to 12, and we were really creating some incredible work very quickly. We learned how to tell stories very fast using all the digital tools available to us. After about a year, though, the New York Times said, we want in on that too, and they were founding what we now call T-Brand Studio, their in-house team that creates content on behalf of advertisers. And we'll talk more about the incredible work that T-Brand Studio is doing in a minute. As my intro said, I was most recently at Time Inc. We have 35 US-based properties, and my role there as Director of Creative Strategy was to help an advertiser figure out, how do I create content that is somehow in context on Time, on People, Sports Illustrated, and perhaps Fortune at the same time. Not an easy feat. What I learned is that it's very different. While the skills we use are the same when we're journalists and when we're brand strategists, we're still telling stories and interviewing sources. We're still writing content and filming videos. The philosophy is very different. When you study journalism, they teach you to tell stories objectively, meaning to back away from anything that you believe or want the story to be, and to just let the story unfold as it should on its own. Brand journalism, by contrast, is the exact opposite. Usually from the outset, you know exactly what story you're trying to tell, and you set out to tell that story. So a lot of people think that these things can't coexist, that if you're a journalist who goes over and tells stories on behalf of brands, that you're selling out. I had a former journalism professor actually comment on one of my stories and write, "Are you proud of yourself?" And I was kind of proud, but that's not the common belief. People don't think that it's as valuable to our audience as the editorial journalism that all the journalists are out creating. They also many times think it's deceptive. If it's not labeled correctly, users don't know where this content's coming from, and they wind up being confused and tricked and have a negative reaction. And for many people, they think it's a conflict of interest, that, if I'm supposed to be a journalist, how could I be telling a story on behalf of a brand and still sleep at night? And it's a good question. It's a lot harder to reconcile, but I don't believe that any of those things are true. I believe that you can have both. And it took a long time of me being the only one to believe that in my circles, until we finally got we finally got a chance to prove it with a wonderful advertiser, Netflix. I was at T-Brand Studio at the time, and Netflix came to us and said, "Season 2 of Orange is the New Black is coming out now. We really want to help people understand that it's based on a true story." Not a lot of people know that. They think it's just sort of a prison sitcom that has these outlandish scenarios, but in truth, it's based on real experiences. It's based on real women who have these true experiences while they were in prison. So their task for us was, can you help us tell this true story? And luckily, being the New York Times, the answer was absolutely yes. So the piece we created is what you see here. I've got screen caps for you. It's called Women Inmates, Why the Male Model Doesn't Work. And it unfolded very much in the way that regular journalism would. So what you see is a 1,500-word investigative piece. I wrote it myself, drawing on my experience from studying investigative journalism. I spent more than 50 hours pouring through thousands of pages of government data and was able to look at that data and see that women were actually ending up back in prison because they weren't being rehabilitated. They were being put through a rehabilitation system designed for men and were ending up back in prison after they had already gotten out. We paired that with trademark New York Times design, which has even advanced since then. This is about 2 years old. Our current designs are much more beautiful, but these graphics you see at the top here, as you scroll, the women would march off the page. So we wanted to make sure we were bringing in the kind of interactivity that our users know and love. We peppered the page with other interactive media too, so there's more of these scrolling animations. In this one, as you scroll further down the page, the family disappears into the distance. We pulled in pull quotes and stats to help bring the data to life and make it more digestible for our readers to experience. We also put in a slideshow so you can see the faces of the women that we spoke to, the current inmates, the former inmates, the prison reform workers, and the people who work tirelessly to try to fix the system that's broken. We included audio so you could hear these women's heartbreaking stories in their own voice because we felt like it was important that we were showing, not just telling. That's the journalism acronym that we wanted to make sure we were bringing into our branded content as well. We also had infographics because, let me tell you, a lot of that data that we were pouring through was not fun to read and not very easy to understand, so we wanted to make it approachable. We also had a 3-part mini documentary, and I would encourage all of you to go find it and watch it. I didn't want to do it up here because they told me I couldn't make everyone cry. But the stories are heartbreaking. This woman was telling us her story. Another woman who was shown in the video had her children adopted while she was serving a short-term sentence for a nonviolent drug offense. Her children were adopted and she hasn't seen them in 20 years. So telling us these very real, very raw stories that you would normally find on the newsroom. And we ended the piece, as these heavy topics often do in a newsroom, with resources, right? You see these stories where someone is talking about a rising trend in suicide and you'll provide a hotline. So we felt that same onus, just like a journalist would feel responsibility for their community, we felt a responsibility for ours, so we included those resources. And what you see here, the season 2 now streaming, that's the brand mention in this piece. Aside from the logo that appears at the top throughout the page to make sure you always know who's creating this content for you, this is where the branding comes in. The only other place, we interviewed the woman who wrote the book that the series is based on. She now works as a prison reform worker, so she had a valid statement to bring to this piece to talk about what was happening in the system. So all of this, I mean, this isn't the kind of thing you'd expect to come from an advertiser, right? I mean, this was real journalism, and that's what we believed, and that's what we wanted to put forth. By all accounts, it was. I mean, we had insane industry coverage, both stateside and abroad, where they were saying it was the piece that turned advertorials mainstream. It was called the Snowfall of branded content, referring to Snowfall being the New York Times' big multimedia piece that changed the way we tell stories online. It was praised by our own newsroom. The late media critic David Carr tweeted it out and said, "All brand journalism doesn't suck." And if you know David Carr, you know that's about as high praise as you can possibly get, so we'll take it. We won a number of awards as well, Best Branded Content for 2014, and we also won a Digiday Award for the video piece in and of itself. And the performance, I think, was the best part for us because it was speaking to us from our audience. The piece organically appeared in the most emailed module on the homepage of the New York Times, meaning that during the week that this piece launched, including all of our editorial content, it was among the most emailed and most engaged with pieces on our site. And that was great, but at the end of the year, we also learned that this was in the top 2% of all content published on NewYorkTimes.com in the entire year. So the lesson that taught us is that if you create content that abides by your editorial standards, that upholds the same value in terms of sourcing, that maintains the same quality of fact-checking and writing, that your content can truly perform like editorial. But in order for that to happen, a lot of different things have to align. These are 4 of the things that we know were aligned in this case. Both Netflix and the New York Times, they identified their power. They knew what they had the authority to speak about and didn't branch out beyond that. They knew their people, so they recognized what their audience was expecting of them and stayed within those bounds so that they didn't disappoint those expectations. They chose their place properly because there are a lot of advertisers and a lot of publishers that try to make these kinds of deals, and it's not always a good fit. Both sides have to be prepared to walk away from a partnership that's not a good fit. And they dressed the part, recognizing that it's New York Times editorial content before and after. You've got to fit that bar in the middle. So for Netflix, knowing your power meant recognizing that prison experience was something they absolutely had the authority to talk about and leaning into that. Instead of talking about plot lines or characters, talking about the real stories. For the New York Times, knowing what was within their power is acknowledging social narratives, which we know are a driving force of some of our top performing content. As far as knowing your audience, Netflix knew that they had something truly powerful in the women's stories that they could help bring to light. And the New York Times knew that our audience would accept nothing less than reliable sources and plenty of data to back it up. As far as choosing the right place, this was a natural fit for both partners because it was an attempt to tell a true story and an attempt to do it in a way that was quality that people had come to know and expect from the New York Times. And then dressing the part, both Netflix and the New York Times have made it their hallmark to create engaging multimedia content that readers engage with deeply. So by all accounts, we were able to put these things together and create a perfect marriage. This quote from Emily Wapnick's TED Talk, I think, speaks best to the process as we're all trying to create blended programs in this new digital reality. Innovation happens at the intersection. That's where new ideas come from. So I hope that for all of you, whether you're a publisher or a brand or an agency representing one, that you're able to find those partners, that you're able to find the intersection. Because it's not only innovation that happens at the intersection, it's also true brand journalism. Thank you.